When I began my college studies at Duke University, rather than welcoming my new freedom and all the fresh possibilities, I was often dissatisfied and struggled to fit in. Being an introverted person, lacking self-confidence, and thus usually spending my Friday and Saturday nights without a date or social activities, I would often retreat to a piano in the music building to play and compose the night away. This and playing basketball with classmates were my only Dionysian outlets. In some respects, my life would perhaps have been more joyful and freeing if I had embraced some of those typical Dionysian activities of youth, sex, drugs, and rock and roll. For college is a time for many young women and men to try completely new things, to go beyond their parental or other conditioned norms, even though such actions in the short term might lead to destructive or counterproductive results. Instead, I locked myself in a confining box. At this point, the Apollonian impulses ruled. I had a very strong moral sense, though inexplicably one that was not based on any formal sense of religious prohibition. My course was ironically the opposite of the life of one such as St. Augustine, whom I have recently been rereading. For much of the first part of his book, The Confessions, he spent lamenting his hedonistic younger years. I was also studying at college those subjects that were not compatible with my true inner nature. As my father was part of an extended family law firm, I was blindly following the traditions of my family, which was largely composed of lawyers, politicians, and power brokers. Surprisingly, my father never pressured me into following these family traditions and encouraged my musical and artistic interests. Yet for some reason, I blindly accepted the status quo and boxed myself into a course for which I was ill-suited. This, of course, only contributed to my deeper frustration and depression. And though my father died of cancer in my freshman college year, it took a few years for these structures and self-expectations to break down. This is the significance of the archetypal tarot card, the Tower, that you see before you. This major arcana card symbolizes the breakdown or destruction of pre-existing constructs, be they material, social, or interpersonal. Though the changes in my perception were at first gradual, eventually all the prior structures of my life would crumble, and from that point my soul would be resurrected anew. This process began my senior year at Duke, when I started taking those classes which my soul truly desired, in art, English literature, and music. After graduating college, I moved to South Carolina to live with a high school friend. Living out in the country, I gained a greater appreciation for the beauties of nature. And for the first time, for 9 months, I took classical piano lessons at the local university. I also had my first experiences with the possibilities of alternative forms of consciousness through the occasional ingesting of marijuana brownies that my friend's wife cooked up. Such experiences were like breathing in the Dionysian life force, which allowed me to relax some of those preconceived constructs and behaviors that I had clung to so tightly. It also provided me with new insights into the possibilities of human consciousness and served to loosen up some of the stiffness in my own personality. These experiences also encouraged a closer relationship with the wonders of nature. After a year in South Carolina, I moved to Tallahassee, Florida, for my last college experience at Florida State University. But before leaving South Carolina, I had a most significant experience of the mind and soul. It occurred in the course of one day when I read a short but very special book. This book was Damien by the great German novelist Hermann Hesse. During that important spring afternoon, upon reading Hesse's novel Damien, I was shown a deeper glimpse into my troubled past, as well as unknowingly into my more luminous future. From the personality and experiences of Hermann Hesse were reflections of my own life and echoes of my own lost soul. Hesse was an artist who, through his writings, subjected himself to stringent self-analysis in a search for his own true identity. At various points in his life, he also had to endure the trials of self-doubt and depression. At the age of 15, though a gifted student, he was unable to face the pressures of school, and thus fled his monastery seminary. Hesse's parents then placed him in a psychological clinic. While there, he attempted to take his own life. The clinical records for the boy offered this familiar diagnosis: melancholy. Many of these experiences were referred to in Hesse's early novel, The Prodigy. This novel was later renamed Beneath the Wheel. It was many years after discovering Damien that I read this earlier book, but when I did, I could readily identify with the protagonist's sense of being crushed by the wheel of life. On the right is the illustration on the cover of this novel, showing the boy about to drown in the waters of life. I could also identify with the protagonist's suicidal thoughts, and though I would never have actually harmed myself, such thoughts often provided a certain solace for me, as offering the hope for release from the great inner pain I felt. The novel Damien was written more than a decade after The Prodigy, amidst the author's personal hardships and the turmoil of the First World War. During this time of depression, Hesse turned to psychological self-analysis at a Jungian clinic, aided by a doctor who was a protege of Carl Jung. This inner investigation by Hesse led to the rich archetypal creation of the book Damien. As Hesse indicates in the novel, the name of the character Damien, who was the protagonist Emil Sinclair's protector and guiding spirit, was derived from the ancient Greek word daimon, which appropriately meant spirit. It was such a daimon, or greater spirit, that Socrates confessed had guided him through his own life's journey. Three of the four main characters in Damien are depicted in the image to the left, taken from the cover of the novel. Emile Sinclair, who served as Hesse's alter ego, as well as Damien, are held in and embraced by Damien's mother, Eva. Later in the novel, Sinclair makes clear the significance and symbolism of Eva when he declares that she is like a universal mother, a metaphor of my inner self, whose sole purpose was to lead me more deeply into myself. For me, such a guiding mother figure took the form of the wisdom goddess, Athena or Sophia. The eagle behind Eva refers to Sinclair's own spiritual self, an ascendant essence that during the course of the novel slowly comes to the fore and breaks away from the limits of his earthly shell. Much of the novel is structured upon the Dionysian-Apollonian dynamic that we have been repeatedly discussing. The beginning of the novel represents an early conflict in Sinclair's life, as he is torn between his safe, light-filled Apollonian family life and the darker threat of chaos from a young tormentor. Early on, Damien introduces Sinclair to the biblical tale of Cain and Abel, as providing a metaphor for these two polar principles. Based upon the interpretations of certain Gnostic sects, the traditional positive-negative roles of the two have by Damien and Hesse been reversed, with Abel now representing the confining limits of the status quo, and Cain the brave Dionysian revolutionary who stands for originality and affirmative will. In this reading, it is the nonconformists, like Cain, Damien, and Sinclair, who are branded and ostracized by conventional society. This theme of spiritual and intellectual independence as articulated by the character of Damien and inspired by certain ideas of the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, touched an inspirational nerve within me, just as Sinclair's emotional struggles also resonated with my own inner experiences. For reading the thoughts of Sinclair was like looking deep into my own soul. Here are a few quotes from the book Damien that indicate much about the nature of the main characters. Each of these characters may be understood as expressing a different aspect of Hesse's own personality. As such, they also revealed hidden parts of my own psyche. I also wish to point out an important principle that threads its way through the book's narrative, just as it does through the world's many mystical traditions. This is the principle of the androgyne, which is to say that state of balance within us where the polar principles of male and female, light and dark, Apollo and Dionysus are merged into one. The importance of this principle of the wedding of opposites in the spiritual quest is announced in the Gnostic Gospel of Thomas when Jesus declares, "When you make the two into one, and when you make the inner as the outer, and the upper as the lower, and when you make male and female into a single one, so that the male shall not be male, and the female shall not be female, then you will enter the kingdom of heaven." In Damien, this principle is embodied in the figure of Abraxas, the primal god found in the Gnosticism of Basilides. This ancient deity is discussed by the characters Damien as well as Pistorius. Abraxas can also be equated with Sinclair's own spiritual essence, which is to say the greater daemon that resides within. The illustration on the right depicts the god Abraxas as he was traditionally conceived. At the top of this artwork, you see the sun and the moon, solar and the lunar principles in their duality. The figure of Abraxas integrates these two polarities. In the right hand, he's holding the fiery whip of the Dionysian principle. In the left hand, he's holding the golden orb of the sun and the Apollonian principle. And the two serpents below also relate to this merger of the two opposites. The older Pistorius, a rather eccentric but accomplished organist, became for Sinclair a sort of mentor and confidant, introducing Sinclair to new ideas and to esoteric traditions. He said of the god Abraxas, "Our God's name is Abraxas, and he is God and Satan, and contains both the luminous and dark world." Pistorius also described himself in a way that very much described my own nature a few years after reading this book. "I must always have things around me which are beautiful and sacred, organ music and mysteries, symbols and myths." Damien, when he first met Sinclair and discussed the Cain and Abel allegory, insisted that one interpret religious stories more freely. This is the way of the mysteries, the metaphoric or symbolic way, as opposed to the literal or simply moral. He also insisted, don't follow the crowd. The majority's path is an easy one. Ours is difficult. This again reflects the Nietzschean principle of self-reliance and affirmative will, and not succumbing to the reflexive impulses of what he called the herd mentality. And finally, Damon, referring to the daemon, the spiritual essence within us, said that within us there is someone who knows everything, wills everything, does everything better than we ourselves. Sinclair described his own feelings and the fact that he was bullied. in a statement that reflected my own feelings when I read Damien. He said, "No one could possibly love me the way I was. I certainly had no love for myself. I was often consumed with self-reproach and worries." Also, Sinclair experiences the duality principle and the androgyne principle after he started painting some portraits, particularly one of Beatrice, a girl who he was very much attracted to. But after a while, these portraits started to transform, and they resembled a kind of god or a holy mask, half male, half female, ageless. I began to sense that this picture was neither of Beatrice or Damon, but myself. Not that the picture resembled me, but it was what determined my life. It was my inner self, my fate, or my daemon. He also said that in these paintings, he was being prepared to heed his own inner voices. And this is something that the world of art opened up for me a few years after reading this book. Also, through the figure of Pistorius and Damien, I was introduced to concepts that would become very much a part of my life a few years thereafter, but at the time were totally unknown to me. For example, Theosophy, Zoroastrianism, Gnosticism, the Hindu Vedas, and Mithras. My move to Tallahassee, Florida marked the beginning of the end. At long last, I was nearing the end of that period of great suffering and darkness in my life. However, upon my arrival in Florida, I was still in the midst of a deep depression. And for the first time in my life, I told my mother in a phone call about my dark secret, even confessing that I had entertained suicidal thoughts. Needless to say, these revelations came to her as a great shock. But with her support, I was able to return to my studies, now at Florida State University. This time, however, I would joyfully embrace my field of study, for I would now be studying visual arts and painting. However, before I could apply to graduate school in visual arts, I had to take certain undergraduate courses and create a small body of artwork. The self-portrait before you is the result of a class assignment in one of these classes. It is this portrait that reflected the new course of my inner journey. For finally, I was ready to directly face all those great forces which lived inside me, to reach for that numinous self that lay hidden in my soul. It was at this point that I began to reclaim my lost spiritual inheritance. To this end, an important gift was given to me, and it came in the discovery of tarot cards. My first exposure to the cards came from a new friend who gave me my first tarot reading. I was quite stunned by the way in which he was able to penetrate into some of the deeper secrets that were buried in my psyche. For this is the great gift of tarot, to be able to provide a means and a visual picture of those archetypal and universal forces which drive our actions and our perception of the world. The fortune-telling aspect of the cards is actually a lower and often a misapplied way of using the cards. For me, when looking upon the major arcana, that is, the 22 archetypal cards that express the order and generation of universal ideas, it was like reclaiming a deeper knowing that had been lost to me. These cards express archetypes that can be linked to certain universal principles, as examined in the work of Carl Jung, as well as in the world's mystical traditions. In the cards, I saw unveiled before me all the powers that had so captivated me in my childhood, those forces that were embodied in the Greek and Roman gods, in the chivalric ideals of knighthood, and in the magic of my own creative imagination. Indeed, the cards provided a means of recapturing much of the joy and wonder that had been so dear to me as a child. Through these archetypes and through my renewed discovery of art, I was now able to understand, even touch those hidden forces that had driven my life for these many years. Thus, I was becoming again the creator and master of my own inner life. In addition, for the first time, I was being exposed to people who reached out for that eternal world which lives beyond the senses. It was from this point in my life that I began my comprehensive study of world religions, mystical traditions, and idealist philosophy, art, and literature. I began to embrace those esoteric and spiritual traditions that were referred to in Hesse's Damien. I thus started to learn the language of symbols, which is to say, the song of the universal all. It was these symbols that provided a gateway to the deep interior of my own consciousness. Or as I state in my book, Aphorisms of Light, symbol, number, myth, and metaphor form the language of eternity. For the first time, I began to understand that eternity could in truth be experienced, and that the universal verities could be manifested on earth. The work of Carl Jung provided me with some important keys in the understanding of these universal ideas that underlie all phenomenon. He calls these recurrent themes or ideas that reside in the depths of every human's collective unconscious the archetypes. The archetype is a principle that was discussed in Plato in his cosmological dialogue, the Timaeus. On the left, you have an image of an alchemical process, and Carl Jung wrote a few books on alchemy in particular. Now, alchemy, as it is generally understood, is that chemical processing by which lead is turned into gold. But of course, beneath these outer physical processes is the true central core of alchemy, which is internal transformation of the human psyche. And the various images and symbols that are used in alchemy are representations of these inner processes. And this is what Carl Jung studied in great detail and provided explanation for these correlations. In this image, you have the division of the light and the darkness, and the light upper half contains the dove, which is the Holy Spirit, or the greater soul, that must descend into the darkness of matter and retrieve the star or solar principle. And it is through the moon of receptivity and human understanding that we can integrate these polarities and thus provide a means of transformation or transmutation of humanity from the lead of matter to the gold of spirit. In the center, we have a major arcana tarot card, the High Priestess. And here you have, again, those Apollonian Dionysian polarities of dark and light and the two pillars, Joachim and Boaz, as they're known in Kabbalah and Masonry. And the feminine figure in the center is the Sophia wisdom archetype. And you can see in her heart, there's the cross, which basically balances these two polarities of masculine, feminine, and spirit and matter. And this feminine figure can be associated with the various white goddesses, the Egyptian mythology, or Athena, or Sophia, and the Greek and Gnostic theologies. So the means here, it's a visual means of balancing those two polarities in the wisdom of the Christ consciousness which resides in our hearts, which is higher mind and spirit. And this transformation from matter to spirit and the release of the spirit from the material world is also represented in the emblem of the phoenix. And interestingly, Christianity at some point adopted this symbol as representing Christ's resurrection, which is to say, the rebirth from the darkness of matter to the light of spirit. Just as the alchemical corpus and the stages of alchemical transformation provide a pattern, an archetypal pattern for the journey of the soul, so do various myths provide metaphors for this internal process. In the Greek myth of Theseus, the hero in one of his quests must confront the Minotaur, the bull-like creature who resided at the center of the maze. Of course, the maze can be understood as a metaphor for the convolutions of our human mind and the journey of our mind and intellect into the depths of our soul, or in Jungian terms, our collective unconscious. The figure of Ariadne provides the means by which our hero can enter the maze, defeat the monster, and return. For Ariadne represents, in one respect, a higher human soul, and in another respect, the procession and tradition of the mysteries. This is embodied in Ariadne's thread, which she gives to Theseus in order that he may enter the maze and return unharmed. This thread represents the knowledge of the mysteries and the archetypes in our human consciousness, which must be confronted and placed in proper order in order to reemerge triumphant from the trials of life and the trials of human consciousness. Greek myth of Perseus, we have another metaphor for the journey of the soul and the initiatory quest. Perseus' conquest of the Gorgon Medusa, with her hair of serpents and a look which can turn men into stone, symbolizes that process whereby the higher reasoning and spiritual powers overcomes the lower serpentine nature of human consciousness. It is the gods Hermes and Athena who give to Perseus the tools by which to overcome the demon of our lower natures. Hermes, as the messenger of the gods, which is to say our higher spiritual power, gives to Perseus his winged sandals, which allow him to fly through the air. This gift represents the power of the spiritual initiate to rise to higher dimensions, into the light of genius in the unseen worlds. The gift of the mirror shield, which is offered by Athena, represents the powers of higher mind and reflective intelligence to see beyond the imprisoning forces of lower instinct and irrational fear. With the aid of these and other gifts, the hero is able to vanquish the monster Medusa within and to complete his or her spiritual quest. With the magical tools of divine transformation in hand, the initiate leaves behind the world of darkness and lower consciousness, which is represented in the alchemical process as the stage of nigredo, or the blackening. Next comes the stage of whitening, albedo, which is a period of purification, dissolution, reintegration, and identification with the spiritual light. Armed with the wisdom of the inviolate goddess Athena, the seeker is able to reconcile the darkness and the luminance within, and bring together in love the polar aspects of our human consciousness. One may then dissolve one's mental and physical limitations, redirecting the inner soul toward her mansions of ceaseless light.